Hey, welcome to your third video of this unit. So in this video, we're going to be covering Earth's complex life forms. So we talked about simplicity. We've talked about how these life forms came to be. Remember, Luca was the first organism that was established based off DNA. So now we're going to look at how Luca has truly evolved into the organisms that we know for today. So obviously, we're not gonna be able to see a huge change in human evolution in our lifetime, but over time we have seen these drastic changes. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're also going to focus on the idea of adaptations and evolution. I remember, just like with every other video I've talked about, it was prefaced with that this is one answer to a question and a very complex question, but we have learned that using evidence to help support our statements is really important. So whatever evidence you have, it should really back up your claim. And so we have been practicing that. I forgot to put an objective slide, but it's okay. I think you'll live without it for today. So in the first part of this, I want to go ahead and review adaptations and evolution. And I told you, I don't want you to be scared of the word evolution. It just means a change. But these two things are not the same thing. Please understand that. So I did include this nice little chart that I got from this website here at the bottom. It really does a good job at just explaining the differences in adaptations versus evolution. So evolution is going to happen over a longer period of time, whereas adaptations are short-term changes that can happen quite quickly in an organism's lifetime. For example, we adapt to a cold environment. We go outside and our body can adapt to that. But the evolution behind that is a longer period of time. So adaptations can be described as characteristics of an organism that help it to survive in a given environment. And this is due to variation. So every organism that ever walked this planet, remember, they all have that same common ancestor, but because of the environment they were put in, they had to change and they had to adapt. And the organisms that could not do that did not last long enough to ensure their species survives. Whereas the organisms that did last were able to reproduce and go on to pass on those genetics that favored survival. In comparison to that, we have evolution, which is changes in the genetic makeup of a species over time. So these small little changes, and oftentimes these are just small little mutations that don't really matter in the broad scheme of things, but over time, those mutations will become essential and will become important and will help make those changes. Those mutations that happen are just that. They are just mutations. They don't really harm the population at all. It's when the environment changes that mutation becomes beneficial, and then the organism can adapt and change. So it's really easy to get adaptation and evolution mixed up. But please remember, one of the biggest things, adaptations are short-term changes, whereas evolution are long-term changes happening over the genetic line or that DNA piece. The other thing I wanted to make sure I made clear is that we talked about mutations as not always being a bad thing, but remember, mutations can also be a bad thing. It's just a random change that happens to an organism. Not all the time will it be a good thing. We see that in humans all the time. We see them having some kind of mutation that causes a genetic disorder. But remember, mutations can also be neutral completely. There's just one little change, doesn't change anything about the organism, doesn't make them special. So mutations that are actually beneficial are rare, and they happen most often due to adaptations and having to survive. So if we look at this chart, a couple of things I wanted to point out. I already pointed out the short term versus the long term, and that's a really good one. I want to make sure that you know. But on here, it says a form or structure modified to fit a changed environment. That's a good definition of adaptation. And then evolution is a change in the heritable characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. And that's a lot of words. Basically, what I'm saying is that we're changing the DNA a little bit for evolution, whereas adaptation, we're just modifying something so that we can fit into that environment. So there are organisms that can survive in the desert. Do they want to? Not necessarily if they're not from that, but they can survive. They can make small adaptations to make sure they survive. Whereas an evolutionary change is complete change of the genetic material of a species to create a new species. The other thing I wanted to point out with this chart is the bottom portion here where it says results in this part here where it says results in phenotypic variation among species. And what this means is that the species looks a little different. And I'm going to talk about a good example in class. It's about a pepper moth in England during the Industrial Revolution timeframe. And so I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, that'll be a good example when we talk about adaptations and how adaptations can be favored, and then eventually that goes on to pass on to the next generation. But adaptations are just changes amongst a species. It's the same species, but something looks a little different about some of them. Whereas evolution is brand new species over a series of time. This was a picture I found and I really, really liked it. This is basically showing us how we go from one species to another through variation, selection, and adaptation. So in this first part, we have these species and what it looks like. There's just a lot of individuals there and they need to survive to maturity. So what's going to happen is there's going to be some sort of variation event where the individuals of a population have many characteristics that differ a little bit. Again, they're the same population, they're the same species, but they have some differences in what they look like. And then for the third event for evolution, again, this is the series of events for evolution. So in the third portion, we're going to have selection, where some organisms are in that population are going to survive because of what they look like. They will survive long enough to survive the environment and to reproduce, which will then cause them to create more for their population. The traits of those individuals that survive and reproduce will become more common in that population. And eventually over time, those variations and adaptations go on to help us with evolution and natural selection. Now in the last few slides, remember, I'm just talking about how we went about going from one type of organism to the complete diversity that we see now in the world. And what paleontologists are really good at is being able to not only identify and figure out what era fossils belong to, but then they're also able to categorize these guys based on what features they had, what variations they had to allow them to survive. So not every single organism that ever walked this planet existed at the same time. And I want you to understand that the organisms that were first out there may not be around today. So we have bacteria, and we had bacteria back then, but it may look completely different. And I want you to get that we stemmed from those organisms. Like, because of them, we are here as a species, but that doesn't mean that they survived this long. So one organism just has, or excuse me, two organisms or one has to just survive in order for the next generation to come about. But it's all that building blocks on top of one another. So we're going to talk about the era where biodiversity really boomed, where this different diversity of modern organisms really started to come about. And this is known as the Phanerozoic era. And this is divided into three eras. And the reason why it's divided into three eras is because there was a drastic extinction event that happened that split these three eras. So the Phanerozoic era is made up of the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. Paleozoic meaning the oldest, and that's approximately somewhere around 500 to 300 million years ago, and we see a really big booming of fish, plants, insects, amphibians, and reptiles. And then we go into the Mesozoic, which is not as old, but it's still relatively old, so that middle intermediate between the old and the new. And this is where we see that big booming of dinosaurs, mammals, birds, and plants. And I want you to understand that the large extinction event that happened to get rid of the dinosaurs was an asteroid or a meteor that hit the Earth. If that would not have happened, then mammals would not have been able to have a fair chance at this world. So really pretty convenient when it comes to the survival and the speciation of us as mammals. And then finally, we have the newer time frame, the younger time frame, the Cenozoic, where we see grass and humans really, really start to evolve. A lot more plant species start to evolve. And that's roughly around 35 million years ago to the present time. So anything now is part of that Cenozoic. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that if you see in this category here, these are also split into longer periods and everything like that. We're not going to focus on that. We're really just focusing on the era knowing that the Cenozoic is the newer time frame, Paleozoic is the oldest, and then the Meso being that center. I want you to also keep in the back of your mind is what other events could be considered extinction events? Like what else could happen to the earth that could cause organisms to completely go extinct? So please keep that in the back of your mind as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is just that modern biodiversity. I already mentioned before that because of LUCA, we were able to become a species that was based on DNA. But how did we get here? And it's due to that change in environment. So diversity is due to the changing environments found on the earth. There should not be a question mark here. That's just really dumb. But it's okay. We all make mistakes, right? But just based on the changing environments found on the earth. So it's because we had to have that changing environment that species change and they adapt, they eventually evolve into a new species, and then we have that branching. If you remember that tree of life, we have all of these branches, and you'll see that it really goes down into LUCA saying that this is the common ancestor, but that LUCA then goes and branches off, and that's only because of the change in environment in the present world at that current moment. The environment can change at any moment. In California a couple years ago, there was a huge rock slide that took out a highway. Now, maybe this is inconvenient for humans because that's a highway to drive on, but it's also inconvenient to species that use that to travel across or go somewhere. So now there's this blockade. So the environment has changed, so they have to adapt. And if you don't adapt, then you die. So diversity is hugely dependent on the environment that is in that present moment. If you have any questions, please make sure to ask me on Edpuzzle. I realize that some of this information is not information that we really necessarily enjoy, and maybe we don't even truly think this is true, and that's okay. But I want to make sure that you're still being able to follow along with all the information we have. So again, ask me anything on Edpuzzle. Thanks.